Water wasn't just scarce in World War II, it was a weapon. Bombs shattered water lines, wells were seized. Plumbing froze in the silence of blackout winters. Civilians didn't ask where clean water would come from, they asked if it would come at all, and when it didn't, they adapted. In the ruins of Warsaw, families strained soot-stained rainwater through boiled rags. In the hills of Serbia, water was collected from moss-covered rocks and disinfected with embers. Across the wreckage of Europe, entire towns survived without a working tap, a filter, or even a container that wasn't cracked. These weren't preppers, they were farmers, widows, and children, forced to find purity in a poisoned world. Every drop they drank was earned, collected, boiled, buried, or sealed by hand. And yet most of what they knew has disappeared. If your water stopped tonight, would you know what they knew then? Subscribe, because when systems fail, only the old ways remain. Number 1. Cloth filtration from rooftop rain during World War II. When cities turned to rubble and infrastructure vanished overnight, collecting rainwater wasn't an option. It was survival. But rooftops, gutters, and broken tiles offered more than just runoff. For civilians without access to plumbing, cloth filtration of rooftop rain became a lifeline. In the wreckage of Warsaw, Rotterdam, and rural villages across Europe, families stationed metal buckets, ceramic basins, or even helmet liners beneath sloped rooftops to capture rainfall. But the water that came down wasn't clean. It carried soot from bombed buildings, dust from collapsed chimneys, bird droppings, and chemical residue from nearby fires. Drinking it raw invited sickness. There was no room for error. To clean it, civilians turned to the most available resource: cloth, flour, sacks, linens, old undergarments. Any tightly woven fabric was boiled to kill contaminants, then stretched across wooden frames or fastened to bucket mouths using twine or wire. Rain would fall, pass through the layered cloth, and drip into a collection container below. Many used double or triple layers, with ash or sand packed between to improve filtration. In countryside homes, pre-used wool blankets were folded to catch finer particles. Boiling the filtered water was ideal, but not always possible. So, to reduce risk, clothes were changed daily, rinsed in clean runoff, and sun-dried to prevent mold. During heavy rains, families rotated between containers, storing water in buried canisters, clay jugs, or wax-lined barrels kept in cool, dark cellars. The system wasn't perfect. It couldn't remove pathogens or invisible contaminants, but it dramatically reduced visible debris, sediment, and surface oils. And in many parts of bombed-out Germany or occupied France, it was the only method available. This wasn't innovation. It was desperation turned into discipline. Children were assigned to rinse clothes. Elders tested water clarity by eye. No filters, no taps, just fabric, patience, and vigilance. And it worked. For thousands, this technique turned ash-colored rain into usable drinking water, one slow drop at a time. Would you trust your life to water caught in silence? Number 2. Buried canister storage. When firebombing raids, leveled cities, and running water vanished overnight. World War II civilians faced a brutal question. Once you find clean water, where do you keep it safe? The answer was simple in form, but strategic in execution. They buried it. In war-torn villages from Belarus to Brittany, civilians repurposed whatever containers they could find. Enamel canisters, kerosene tins, sealed glass jars, and even army surplus fuel cans. These weren't stored on shelves. They were lowered into the earth, hidden beneath floorboards, stashed in root cellars, or buried outside beneath haystacks and sheds. The soil itself became insulation, shielding the water from light, heat, contamination, and theft. In Poland, families wax-sealed the rims of ceramic pots before burying them in garden trenches. In parts of Yugoslavia, surplus metal jugs were lined with cloth and sand to prevent corrosion before being lowered into deep holes. The canisters stayed cooler underground, avoiding bacterial growth, and more importantly, they stayed invisible. This method wasn't just about preservation, it was about protection. In cities under occupation, soldiers often confiscated visible food and water supplies. Burying clean water was a way to avoid detection and to outlast siege conditions that lasted weeks without access to fresh supply. To maintain cleanliness, each container was boiled before use, and the burial sites were marked with discrete stones or notches in fence posts. Never visible signs, some families buried multiple small canisters instead of one large vessel to reduce risk if one was found or damaged. In colder climates, deeper burial helped prevent freezing, but the system had flaws. If a seal failed, soil seeped in. If the wrong material was used, like untreated tin or thin glass, the water turned metallic or foul. Digging during winter months was nearly impossible. Still, when done right, this method allowed families to store days, even weeks' worth of clean water, without a single tap. This wasn't storage. It was survival in silence, where every liter was protected like food, and every seal told a story of foresight. If your water had to vanish underground to stay safe, would you know where to dig? Subscribe, and recover the systems that buried water before it disappeared. Number 3. Boiled rag filtration over cracked pot. In bombed-out homes across Eastern Europe, civilians didn't wait for perfect tools to secure drinkable water. They worked with what the war left behind. Cracked enamel pots, broken crockery, a rag and a flame. That was enough. One of the most overlooked methods of water cleaning during World War II involved boiled rag filtration, a simple, silent trick that turned shattered cookware into life-saving filters. After air raids in places like Kyiv, Dresden, and rural Bohemia, families often salvaged what little remained. Whole cooking sets were gone, but cracked containers, enamelware with chipped rims, fractured pots with broken handles were still usable. They lined the interiors with cloth, linen strips boiled beforehand to kill bacteria and remove residue. Some boiled the cloth multiple times in ash water or vinegar for extra sterilization. These rags were stretched across the inside surface of the damaged pot, or draped over the top and secured with string, wire, or makeshift wooden clamps. Rainwater, snowmelt, or puddle runoff was poured through slowly. The cloth trapped visible debris, ash particles, grit, insect fragments, and the container, though cracked, was supported externally by dirt mounds or baskets to hold its structure. It was a slow method. Each batch took time, and only small amounts could be filtered at once. But in homes without access to functioning plumbing or tools, it was one of the few available options. Some families layered multiple rags, each finer than the last, allowing gravity to do the work. Others let water rest in the cloth-lined container for hours, allowing sediment to settle, then poured off only the clear upper portion. Children were taught to rinse the cloth daily, reboil it at night, and inspect it for damage. Elderly women often kept 3 or 4 rags ready, some for dust-heavy rain, others for snowmelt. No cloth was discarded lightly. Torn garments, diaper cloth, flour sacks, all became filtration tools. The results weren't crystal clear, but for thousands, it reduced sickness. It bought time, and it turned broken cookware into the last line of defense against dehydration. If all you had was a pot with a crack and a rag, could you still survive? Subscribe to learn what war taught about resilience without resources. Number 4. Boil and bury water banking in cities and villages torn by World War II. Boiling water wasn't enough. Keeping it clean afterward was the greater challenge, with no running taps and constant exposure to dust, ash, and contaminated surfaces. Civilians needed a way to preserve clean water over time. That's where one of the most disciplined and forgotten methods emerged. Boil and bury water banking. Families in occupied France, bombed-out Belgium, and parts of western Ukraine boiled every drop they could gather. Rainwater, snowmelt, even runoff from roof gutters. The boiling wasn't quick. It was rolling, sustained, and often done over open fires in chimneys, shielded with black cloth to avoid drawing attention. But boiling was just the first half. Once clean, the water was funneled into sealed containers, ceramic jugs, army canisters, thick glass bottles corked and waxed. These were then buried deep underground or in insulated cellars where temperatures stayed low. Light couldn't reach, and contaminants were sealed out. This wasn't about hiding water from others, it was about preventing recontamination in unstable, filthy environments. Burial sites were chosen carefully, not near latrines, not near trash heaps. The soil was often pre-dug and lined with dry straw or cloth to cushion the containers. Each family had a system. Some marked the soil with stones in silent code, 1 for drinking, 2 for rationing, 3 for emergency. Others buried water beside preserved food caches for faster access in curfew hours. The process was laborious. Containers had to be lifted gently, wax seals checked, cloth coverings replaced. Every week, some portion was rotated, reheated, or replaced in homes without plumbing for months or even years. This method allowed families to maintain a steady, uncontaminated supply of drinking water. Its limits were strict. A single cracked seal meant the batch was wasted. Containers buried too shallowly risked freezing, yet for those who maintained the system, boil and bury became the closest thing to a water grid, invisible, reliable, and guarded like gold. This wasn't emergency storage, it was daily life under collapse, silent banking of the one resource that couldn't be replaced. If water vanished for weeks, would you know how to store every boiled drop? Subscribe and learn the wartime system that turned Earth into a vault. Number 5. Rooftop ice collection in freezing cities in the deep winters of 1942 and 1943. Civilians in cities like Leningrad, Berlin, and Minsk faced a quiet but deadly reality. Snow was everywhere, yet drinkable water was rare. With bombed-out plumbing systems, no gas to heat homes, and firewood too scarce to waste on melting snow. Civilians turned to a colder solution, harvesting rooftop ice. It began with observation. As snow fell and temperatures plunged, thin layers of ice formed on exposed rooftops, gutters, and tin sheets. But unlike street snow, often trampled, polluted, or salted by occupying forces, rooftop ice was relatively clean. Civilians climbed upper levels or leaned from broken windows to chip it off, using spoons, scrap metal, or sticks. It wasn't gathered in piles. It was peeled, flaked, and chipped with care. The key was timing. The ice was thickest just before dawn. Families took turns retrieving it, often in silence, often while the city slept. Chipped ice was collected in cloth bundles or wooden bowls, then stored in basins lined with rags to prevent refreezing indoors. When sunlight crept in through broken shutters, the ice melted slowly, yielding small but critical amounts of clean water without the need for fire. This technique became vital in blockaded cities. In Leningrad, it was common to see women and children gathering ice from warehouse rooftops or the edges of bombed factories, avoiding open areas where snipers could reach. In Budapest, whole families shared ice routes, rotating rooftops by week to avoid overharvesting and spreading contamination. The limits were harsh. Rooftop ice was clean only if nearby chimneys still operated or ash settled overnight, the ice had to be discarded, and the yield was slow, often just enough for tea or soaking dried bread. But for many, it meant survival during weeks when no fire could be risked and no rain would fall. This method wasn't efficient. It was quiet, cold, and patient, like the war itself. But it proved something few today remember. Even in a frozen city, clean water could still be harvested, one shard at a time. Could you chip water off a rooftop to keep your family alive? Number 6. Snow-to-drink methods without fire in the frozen winters of World War II. Across the Russian front, northern France, and the Carpathian Hills, snow was everywhere, yet thirst was a constant threat. Firewood was rationed or gone. Chimneys gave away positions, and fuel for melting snow wasn't worth wasting. Civilians needed water, but they couldn't use fire. So, they turned to slower, colder, but effective methods to make snow drinkable without a single flame. The process started with patience. Families gathered clean, untouched snow, not surface layers, but scooped from shaded spots where animals hadn't passed. It was packed tightly into wool sacks, fabric-lined baskets, or metal containers wrapped in cloth. Then came the trick: body heat. Snow-filled sacks were held under coats during the day, pressed between layered clothing and skin. In trench-lined homes or bombed apartments, containers were placed near sleeping areas where body heat naturally raised temperatures. Some villagers wore snowpacks beneath thick wool garments during walks, letting it melt slowly against their core and saving the runoff in hidden pouches. In more desperate areas, civilians created insulated thaw boxes, crates lined with hay, ash, or rags. Snow was packed inside in the morning and left untouched. By evening, a small amount of meltwater collected at the bottom, enough to sip or mix with soaked grains. Children were often tasked with managing the system. They swapped out partially melted snow, rotated packs to warmer spots, and collected every drop in glass jars or enamel mugs. Not a drop was wasted. Even slush was filtered through cloth to remove sediment before drinking. This method wasn't fast. It required entire households to think hours ahead. But it had no smoke, no flame, and no risk of exposure. And it worked. Not to produce gallons, but to provide enough. Some families combined this with fermentation water or added a pinch of salt to accelerate melt. Others layered snow between two warm stones and captured the runoff. The methods were crude, but they saved lives in temperatures where thirst could kill faster than cold. If fire disappeared in winter, could you still drink from the frozen world around you? Subscribe and recover the silent systems that turned snow into survival. Number 7. Ash and charcoal purification during World War II. When filtration systems collapsed and chemicals were unavailable, civilians across Eastern Europe turned to what remained in their hearths, ash and charcoal. Not for warmth, not for cooking, but for purification. What had once been fuel became a filter, a way to make dangerous water drinkable when no other options existed. In rural Ukraine, Hungary, and parts of occupied Poland, families used the fine white ash left from hardwood fires and charcoal scraped from burned logs. These materials weren't discarded. They were saved in cloth sacks, glass jars, or old flour tins, because when water became murky or foul-smelling, this was all they had. The method was basic but effective. A cloth-lined funnel or cracked clay jug was layered with coarse charcoal at the bottom, fine ash above it, and another cloth layer at the top. Dirty water was slowly poured through. As it passed through ash and charcoal, the mixture trapped sediment, reduced odor, and absorbed some impurities. The result wasn't crystal clear, but it was safer, tasteless, and drinkable. In bombed-out cities where chimneys no longer functioned, people collected ash from communal ovens or collapsed buildings. In the countryside, families specifically burned certain woods, like oak or beech, to produce the cleanest ash. Children were taught to crush charcoal into powder, pack it tight, and clean the cloth layers daily to avoid bacterial buildup. For added safety, some civilians boiled the water after filtration, if fuel allowed. But even without heat, the ash-charcoal system turned visibly filthy water into something that no longer smelled of oil, soil, or decay. In desperate situations, even stagnant rain barrel water or snowmelt from soiled rooftops could be reclaimed this way. Its limits were real. It didn't kill pathogens. It couldn't make sewage or poisoned water safe. But for countless families with nothing else, it was a quiet form of control, a way to fight sickness with soot. Today, this method is all but forgotten. But in a war without filters, without tablets, without clean supply, ash and charcoal meant survival. Scraped from ruin. If your filters were gone, could you purify what fire left behind? Subscribe and recover the blackened wisdom that once kept thirst at bay. Number 8. Do catching with cloths in the early hours before dawn. When the world was silent and the threat of detection low, World War II civilians stepped outside, not to flee, not to gather food, but to collect dew. It sounds impossible by modern standards, but in arid zones of occupied Greece, the Balkans, and southern Italy, families learned to extract drinking water from the morning air using nothing but cloth. Dew catching required precision. Cloth strips, often from cotton shirts, flour sacks, or old bed sheets, were tied to fence posts, hung across wires, or wrapped around poles. Overnight, the temperature drop caused moisture in the air to condense on these surfaces. At sunrise, the cloth was saturated. Families, especially children, moved quickly. The fabric was wrung out by hand into clay pots or enamel mugs. The process was repeated until every drop had been claimed. Though the yield was small, a well-placed cloth could produce up to half a cup of water. In places where rain didn't fall for weeks, or where streams had been contaminated or claimed by enemy patrols, this was enough to prevent dehydration. Placement was key. Civilians positioned cloths in shaded areas with airflow, near fields, stone walls, or abandoned structures that radiated nighttime coolness. Some added mesh screens or elevated the cloths with sticks to prevent dust and ground insects from contaminating the water. Others created multi-layered systems. The top layer caught the dew. The bottom layer funneled the drops into a clean jar. It wasn't glamorous, it was tedious. Some had to repeat the process with dozens of clothes just to fill a single bottle. But it worked, silently, invisibly, without fuel or flame. And most importantly, it could be done while the world still slept. This method demanded discipline. Clothes had to be clean, containers sealed, harvest completed before the sun rose too high and evaporated everything. Still, in regions cut off from natural sources, Dew catching became a dependable, if humble, technique, an act of survival in the margins of the day. If there were no taps, no rain, and no river, would you know how to drink from the air itself? Subscribe and rediscover the methods that wrung life from the morning silence. Number 9. Stone drip systems from condensation. In the scorched outskirts of North Africa and the occupied Mediterranean islands during World War II, civilians couldn't count on rain, rivers, or even morning dew. The heat was relentless, and open movement was dangerous. Yet, even in this harsh climate, they found a way to harvest water from condensation itself, using nothing but stones, cloth, and patience. The system was simple in principle but required precision. Large flat stones were arranged in shaded areas during the night, where temperatures dropped just enough to allow atmospheric moisture to condense on their cool surfaces. Beneath each angled stone, civilians placed small metal cups or ceramic bowls to collect the slow drip of water that formed along the edges. To increase the effect, cloths soaked in salt water were laid nearby, drawing moisture from the air through evaporation. Some even buried containers partially into the earth, letting cool ground temperatures speed up condensation. In narrow alleys or bombed courtyards, families placed these setups in corners protected from wind, using tarps or rubble to create still air pockets. The yield was small, just a few spoonfuls at a time. But in places where every drop counted, it was water earned with nothing but stone and air. Would you wait all night for one sip of water? Number 10. Solar cloth funnels from war-torn fields in sun-beaten fields across Sicily, Libya, and the scorched interiors of southern France. World War II civilians couldn't rely on rain, wells, or rivers, but they still pulled water from the earth, not by digging but by capturing it through sunlight. One of the most ingenious techniques was the solar cloth funnel, a low-tech, fuel-free method to extract clean water from soil using only heat, cloth, and time. The process began at dawn. Civilians dug shallow pits in sunlit areas, no deeper than a foot. In the center of each pit, they placed a small, clean cup or jar. Around the cup, damp soil, grass, or even urine-soaked rags were arranged in a ring, maximizing moisture exposure. Then came the funnel. A thin, translucent cloth or plastic sheet was stretched over the pit and weighted at the center, directly above the container with a small stone. As the sun heated the pit, moisture from the materials below evaporated, condensed on the underside of the cloth, and dripped down into the cup. This produced distilled water, free from grit, chemicals, or salt, with nothing but solar heat and captured condensation. Some families improved results by lining the pit with dark metal scraps to absorb heat faster. Others replaced the funnel cloth daily to prevent salt and dust buildup. In desert regions of Tunisia, elderly women created multiple pits at once, rotating their position throughout the day to track the sun's intensity. The yield was slow. A single pit might only produce a cup or two in a full day, but it was clean, fireless, and invisible. Ideal for environments where smoke or boiling could draw attention. Its limitations were harsh. Cloud cover stopped the process. Poor materials meant water loss, and disturbing the seal too soon wasted hours of potential condensation still. This method delivered pure water in terrain that seemed lifeless, a silent form of extraction in places where even wells had failed. This wasn't innovation for comfort. It was survival by physics. Sunlight, pressure, patience, and cloth. If all you had was a patch of dirt and the sun, could you make your own water? Subscribe and reclaim the wartime systems that made nothing into enough. They didn't have filters, pipes, pumps, or purification tablets. What they had was war. And from that war came systems, not born in labs, but carved in desperation. World War II civilians didn't wait for aid. They bent fabric into funnels, pulled water from the sky, buried canisters beneath ruined fields. Every drop was a calculation. Every sip earned. These weren't preppers. They were survivors of collapse, and yet almost all of it is forgotten. Today, we scrolled past the knowledge that once held empires together in silence. But you don't have to forget it. If this video showed you even one method worth remembering, don't leave empty-handed. Subscribe now, because when the grid fails, when the flame dies, when the water stops, it won't be your gear that saves you. It'll be what you remember.